In 1968, the year a USAID official coined the term Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug gave a victory lap speech at a wheat meeting in Australia. 20 years before, he said Mexican farmers had reaped about 760 pounds of wheat from every acre planted. Now that figure had risen to almost 2,500 pounds per acre, triple the harvest from the same land. The same thing was happening in India, he said. The first Green Revolution wheat had been tested there just in 1964-1965 growing season. It had been so successful that the government had tested it on 7,000 acres the next year. And now, which again, this was 1968, it was covering almost 7 million acres. The same thing was happening in Pakistan. And this didn't even count the Green Revolution rice, also short and disease resistant, which was spreading across Asia. That is an excerpt from the book we'll be talking about here today, The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles C. Mann. The subtitle is Two Remarkable Scientists and Their Dueling Visions to Shape Tomorrow's World. And of course, one of those scientists, the wizard, was Norman Borlaug. So two subjects of the book that we'll be talking about today, although we'll be focused just on Norman Borlaug for today's episode, and two hosts today. Not only myself, but also joining me is my friend and regular co-host on the show, Rishi Pete. Rishi, thank you so much for doing this again.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for having me for one more episode. These have been fun, and especially this one. I've been a big fan of this book for a long time, and I'm very excited to have the privilege to discuss this with you.
Yeah, and you and I both read this book somewhere around like 2018, 2019, and revisited it, of course, for this episode. I knew I wanted to do this because I loved the book so much the first time I read it. The second pass through, it was even better than I remembered, but it also became clear to me that we couldn't do a full book summary in one podcast episode. So we decided to focus on the wizard in the context of the title, The Wizard and the Prophet, which is Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution. Just for those of you who are wondering, like, okay, well, who's the prophet? It's somebody named William Vogt, who is a conservationist, really did a lot of early work on what we now know as kind of the conservation movement. We will probably talk about him on a future episode. So save that one in the back of your mind for now. But for today, let's talk about Norman Borlaug. And the story of Norman Borlaug, at least in the context of agricultural innovation, is the story of the Green Revolution. And so, Rishi, I think most people listening have probably heard of the Green Revolution. Most probably have a sense of what it was talking about. But for those who maybe don't, could you give us maybe a little bit one-on-one version of what we talk about when we mention the Green Revolution?
In summary, Green Revolution is the rapid increase in crop yields, especially in South Asia in the 1960s. Prior to 1960s, crop yields, especially for staple crops like wheat and rice, and even a lot of other crops, were very low because of various reasons like lack of mechanization, access to good quality seeds, access to irrigation. But what the Green Revolution did, and which is what we'll talk about a lot, Norman Borlaug was a giant figure who helped kick off this rapid increase in yields. And the bottom line is that prior to this kickoff in rapid increase in yields, a lot of these countries were not food secure. They were dependent on imports or other sources, or people were going hungry. But after this thing kicked off, a lot of those countries have become food self-sufficient, which is a massive human achievement. Literally hundreds of millions of people have access to food now at reasonable prices.
Yeah. If you're lucky enough to never have experienced hunger or seen what real hunger looks like in person, it is something that will stick with you, I think, forever. My brief exposure to this was a trip to Liberia I took in 2012, where I got to interview farmers and see kind of what food insecurity really, really looked like. And it has stuck with me. And it actually, informs a lot of what I do and a lot of my philosophy on agriculture and the future of agriculture. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you can't look at agriculture the same way because and there's some pictures actually in this book, in The Wizard of the Prophet, where you'll see kind of what that hunger, that situation looked like back at that time. But just to give you some numbers on what we're talking about when we refer to the Green Revolution here, what I just said about Mexico, so 760 pounds of wheat for every acre planted, then 20 years later, triple that, 2,500 pounds per acre. In Pakistan, 5 million tons in 1965. In just 5 years later, 8 million tons. So over a 50% increase in production there in 5 years. India, 12 million tons in 1965 to 20 million tons in 1970. Again, just a short period of time. And that's just in wheat. That doesn't even count rice. And that spread obviously to many Asian countries, rice producing countries. Even in the midst of the Vietnam War, this seed, these systems of irrigation, of fertilizer, were spreading across country. And another quote in the book, he says, Charles C. Mann says, even though the continent's population soared, Asians had an average 30% more calories in their diets. Millions upon millions of families had more food, better clothing, and money for school. Pretty incredible story, especially considering this was all started by Norman Borlaug, who kind of had his own story of like getting off the farm and getting opportunity because of agricultural technology, Rishi. And this kind of goes back to the last episode you and I did on kind of history of agriculture episode, Tractor Wars.
Yes, absolutely. And as I was reading through those passages in the book, what we talked about during Tractor Wars, this was a real life example of what somebody went through as a child. I mean, you could even say that, Henry Ford actually started the Green Revolution, that if he didn't have the tractors, Norman Borlaug would have been stuck on his farm helping his family, and then he would not have been able to do a lot of things. I know that's a bit of a reach, but, you could draw these lines fairly easily and say one thing led to another, which led to something else, which led to millions of people being fed, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even Norman Borlaug kind of said as much. So to give you a sense, he was born 1914 in Cresco, Iowa. Very rural part. I don't think he was even born in Cresco. They lived like outside of Cresco, and he didn't even think he was going to have a chance to go to high school in Cresco because he had to stay home and work on the farm. But the book talks about how his dad bought a Fordson Model F, and we talked about that tractor in the last episode. We'll link to that episode if you didn't listen to it, but it's about the book Tractor Wars and how tractors kind of reshaped farming worldwide. But his dad bought one of these Fordson Model Fs, and I'll quote the book again. Charles C. Mann says, on small farms like Henry Borlaug's, which is Norman's father, as much as half of the land was devoted to providing feed for the animals used to cultivate the rest. No longer needing draft animals, writes Borlaug biographer Wiedmeyer, Henry Borlaug sold most of his cattle and horses, planted what had been their pasture, and changed oats to maize. The extra production meant extra money, which allowed him to buy more fertilizer and better seed, further increasing production. Ultimately, Henry's harvest quadrupled on the same land. The extra money let him send his children to school without regret. Man minus the machine is a slave, proclaimed Henry Ford back in those days, touting his new tractor. Man plus machine is a free man. Decades afterwards, and this is still quoting the book here, decades afterwards, looking back on the Model F, Borlaug agreed entirely. Relief from endless drudgery, he said, equated to emancipation from servitude.
Yes, what a fantastic story.
Yeah, so that's how kind of his trajectory into the work he would do, his life's work, the Green Revolution, sort of started. He'd go on to major in forestry and then get a PhD in plant pathology. But it still wasn't a linear path. After he got his PhD, he ended up going to work for DuPont for a little bit and then was recruited by an advisor he had through his PhD program, Dr. Stackman, to go down to Mexico. And that's sort of where the trajectory of his career changed. But his mission down there wasn't even to start the Green Revolution, right? It was more specifically to address this problem of stem rust. His background was in plant pathology, and they had this wheat stem rust problem. There's a picture in the book, actually, of what the wheat fields looked like in Mexico at that time. And they were planting these individual wheat plants, like, I don't even know how far apart. It looks like a foot or more apart, like individual plants in a field, because they didn't want the stem rust to spread. And so just a really, if you've ever seen a wheat field today, you think that's crazy, right? Just a really, really sad state of affairs because they were fighting this big stem rust problem. I mean, he had very little direct training. He'd worked on stem rust and flax. That was his closest relevant experience. But he hadn't been really breeding new varieties. This was kind of all new and also speaking no Spanish.
Yes, and I think it is very interesting to note here that when he went to Mexico and when he got there, there was absolutely zero infrastructure. There was maybe a ramshackle building with leaky roofs. There was a little bit of a trial plot to run some experiments. And when Borlaug got there, he had a massive imposter syndrome. You think about this, like, Dr. Norman Borlaug having an imposter syndrome. And he was like, I'm in the wrong place. I don't know anything about wheat breeding. There are no facilities here. I'm 100% going to fail. And that was sort of his initial thought in his mind. And there were a lot of other challenges as well, right? I think there was some issues around the project wanted to make sure that this does not come across as, we are trying to look down upon Mexico. There should not be any hints of colonialism, etc. That, we are here to help you guys. And, that was not always available because of various reasons. So it was in a very challenging spot that he landed with a massive imposter syndrome. And to go from there to where he ended up is just crazy. And so I think as you read through the book, right, you realize how difficult it was to do breeding and try to go through successive lines of different varieties of wheat, and how do you crossbreed them, because wheat on its own, and there's something, Tim, you've tackled in your other podcast, how complicated the wheat genome is. And this is a point in time where people didn't even know what a genome was. They were just going by the physical attributes of the plant to see, were they growing well, were they lodging, how did the grains look, and then inoculating a lot of these different lines with the pathogen to see how did they react. And it was back-breaking work. They were working from early morning to late night, going through these experiments. It was not straightforward. And, Borlaug, you get a sense that he was impatient because he wanted to solve these problems sooner, and the process was slow. So I don't know Tim, what did you feel about how they went about just setting up these experiments, Borlaug, and, he recruited some local members. And there's some funny passages in there when he showed up first with a ramshackle piece of equipment, and he wanted to borrow a tractor or some piece of equipment from the locals. Nobody wanted to give him because they thought he was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that stood out to me about that time in the story was he won them over with his work ethic. They could see him out there working 7 days a week, doing whatever it took, showing up with no equipment, no resources, and just working completely focused on trying to create, better production systems for farmers. And that won over other local farmers who started helping him out, lending him equipment, and things started to happen. I also, your point on, we didn't know what a genome was at that point. And so for those kind of following along in history here, he went to Mexico in 1944. Watson Crick kind of unveiled their discovery of the double helix, DNA in 1952 or 3, I think it was. So we are years before we know much at all about genetics, and he's just out there trying his best to breed better phenotypes. What he sees that he likes, get more of. What he sees he doesn't like, get less of, over and over and over again. But in those days, it could take 15 years or more to develop a variety that way, especially one that's resistant to a nasty disease like stem rust. So he came up with this new system for breeding, which I think he called shuttle breeding.
Yes, shuttle breeding, yeah. One of the challenges with wheat and rice as well compared to maize is that maize is open pollinated and it scatters it pollen far and wide, whereas wheat and rice, they typically are self-pollinating. And because of this, it creates real, big challenges when you really want to control and understand which of the lines and varieties are actually pollinating with each other, and to know which one to advance to the next generation, if you will. These are some of the challenges that he faced. When he was at the research station, he found that some of his seeds that he had planted, and he got a lot of these seeds from other places as well, right? From the research that was being done in Iowa and Minnesota. He got some seeds from some other places. And because each of these florets are bisexual with both male and female reproductive organs, they had to be really, really careful in going out and cutting off or covering the female part or the male part so that they didn't cross-pollinate with each other on the same plant. And as I was reading through this, I was trying to imagine myself in that situation where you're going plant by plant, you're creating the little paper envelopes, sticking them onto one of the parts, male or female part, and cutting out the other part so that you only have a female set of plants or only a male set of plants, and covering the other part so that the plants don't self-pollinate, basically.
Yeah. And to keep it in perspective here, this is a guy from Iowa, was living in Delaware, working for DuPont when he decided to make this move. He already had one child. after he moved, his wife gave birth to his second child, who was born with spina bifida, which ended up being terminal for the child at that time. I think now it can be treated, but so lost a child, was doing this work in a very remote area of Mexico, and didn't have a whole lot of support. He wasn't in it for the money, had a million reasons to give up. Yields at first were very low. That shuttle breeding referred to how he would go from two different locations that I think were like 700 miles or something apart from each other, and run, one growing season at one and then one growing season at other to try to speed up this time. Still was getting low yields. Then when he finally got the yields up, he had major problems with lodging. I mean, the barriers, the resiliency, just the commitment it took to get this going, to make progress, is extremely inspiring to me. And whenever we do these stories, Rishi, I think I say the same thing, which is like, man, I hope there are still people like that. Still people willing to make the types of sacrifices that he made with no clear assurances of any success whatsoever. I mean, his motives really sure seemed to be genuinely altruistic. Like, he saw hunger, he saw the devastation of these incredibly low yields, and he kept at it. And I mean, ultimately, over the course of, like we said at the beginning, this 20-year transformation for Mexican wheat, he was able to breed shorter stature, higher yielding varieties of wheat that were also disease resistant. So he kind of went above and beyond what the expectation of him was not just disease resistance, but shorter stature, higher yielding plants that could be planted in a much higher density and, convert more energy into yield. And so that essentially was the basis of what would then become the Green Revolution. But Rishi, I think, if it were to stop there, it'd be an incredible story on its own. But it sure didn't stop there. And I think the part of the story of him kind of connecting with Swaminathan is how I'm going to pronounce it, because that's how I've been pronouncing it in my head. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but Swaminathan, and then kind of taking this approach to India is just an incredible part of the story as well. Do you want to talk some about that?
Yes. So, basically based on the work that they had done, and something to sort of give some credit to the scientist who was saying that, hey, if you try to take it to a different region, it won't work. As most of agriculture is very context dependent, and a particular seed or variety which works in one region is not guaranteed to work in another region. But what Borlaug had been able to do was to get these sort of high yielding seeds, and he called it as a package. And the package included sort of the shorter stature that Tim alluded to, the disease resistance that Tim talked about. And then if you combine that with, higher fertilization rate and good irrigation, Borlaug felt that, these packages would potentially work in many different parts of the world. Having said that, it still needed to, they had to make it work in different regions. So, Borlaug traveled to India, worked with Swaminathan, who was a scientist over there in the agriculture department and part of the government. And they set up a lot of trials. And even those trials initially had challenges because of logistics and transportation issues in terms of how seed was sent from Mexico and the US to India and Pakistan. But a lot of those trials, they showed positive results. And those local trials, they helped them understand what else they had to do to make those varieties work well in those regions. But, everybody was very pleasantly surprised initially when they got results which nobody had seen before in those regions because of the superior genetics that Borlaug and his team had brought there. And so if you look at some numbers, right, wheat yields in India and the US in 1961, in India, it was 0.85 tons per hectare, and in the US, it was 1.6 tons per hectare, so almost double in the US. In 2023, wheat yields in India on a per hectare basis are actually higher than in the US. There are 3.52 tons per hectare in India and 3.27 tons per hectare in the US. This data comes from our Walden data. And this obviously happened over 60 years, but even early on, they could see a sudden jump in yields, and then they were able to continue to optimize that performance to continue to get higher and higher yields over the last 60 years. So it was basically a miracle for those farmers to see such high yields with different varieties.
It's incredible. And one of my favorite parts of doing these history episodes is I always find at least one what I'll call a character in the story that like, oh, I need to do an episode just on that person. And Swaminathan is that person in today's episode. Like, I think the book even said at one point, like, we give a lot of credit to Borlaug, and it's rightfully so. Swaminathan was right there with him, and in another version of the story, it could have been the other way around, where Swaminathan, kind of was the leader of the Green Revolution, and Borlaug was. They were contemporaries, and certainly the book offers a lot of evidence of how significant he was, especially with that system getting to India.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think he himself, Swaminathan himself, was a brilliant scientist. He studied, I think, in Oxford or Cambridge somewhere, and he was really good with just getting results. That's what the book says. Any problem you threw at him, he was able to figure out a solution when it came to some of these issues. And you're absolutely right. Borlaug brought the science and a lot of the know-how based on all the experimentation that he had done and learned over those 6 or 7 years in Mexico. And then Swaminathan was very well versed with what would work in those local conditions and how could you adapt that technology to a different context, and how do you scale that up, right? And I think this also goes back to some of the other episodes that, Tim, you've done. As I was reading this, I was thinking about sort of Haber and Bosch, right? Haber started the process, but then Bosch really helped scale this, right? So there are parallels between these two folks here and Haber and Bosch as well. So that was very interesting to me as well.
Yeah, none of these innovators did it alone, right? I think it's very critical to acknowledge the people that played, a central role in making these innovations not only come to life, but also, the more important thing, actually be used. But, one fact is there's no like happily ever after when it comes to agriculture innovation. There's always like trade-offs, right? More production also meant more fertilizer. And so, fertilizer rates have gone up significantly since the Green Revolution. And it's one of the criticisms of the Green Revolution. I just want to be clear before we go down this road, feeding starving people is the right thing to do, full stop. There's no caveats to that whatsoever. But I don't think we would be doing the story justice if we didn't acknowledge that there are some criticisms of the Green Revolution, and there are some trade-offs that have been made that not everybody is excited about, and rightfully so. They're trade-offs that I think we all wish didn't have to happen for this to be the case. But I do want to talk about some of that. So, the book is called The Wizard and the Prophet, and it does say there are dueling visions. And so you had Borlaug on one side, which is, hey, innovation can solve this hunger problem, this environmental problem, innovation can solve it. And sort of the other view, if I'm going to kind of distill them both down to the very basic level, is that, innovation, or man's desire to control nature, is the problem. And so what we need to do is sort of study more ecosystems and let the ecosystems sort of, return to balance. I don't know that I'm doing either perspective justice there, but that's sort of the general idea of the wizard and the prophet. So as we talk about kind of criticisms of the Green Revolution, what stood out to you as you read kind of those parts of the book, Rishi?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely double down on the view that we are not saying that what happened was bad. I think that this is after the fact. It was absolutely the right thing to do to feed those people. I mean, quick personal story here. My parents tell me that in the 1960s, when there were wars between India and China and India and Pakistan, the prime minister of the country told all the citizens that he should eat rice only once a week, or reduce the consumption because our troops don't have the rice. Unfortunately, those wars have not stopped. Those still happen, but now the government doesn't tell the people that, hey, don't eat, right? So you see that even sort of, I've noticed that in day-to-day life. So coming to sort of the discussion around what were some of the trade-offs, as Tim alluded to here. So obviously the production went much higher in those countries. They became, food self-sufficient. They become actually exporters, some of these countries, of food. But that came with heavy use of fertilizer and irrigation. And some of those things were, especially fertilizer, because it's expensive, was available to some of the larger and richer farmers. Right? So that is one criticism, that even though the Green Revolution was very good, it may be left behind some of the smaller farmers because they did not have access to some of the tools that were necessary for Borlaug's innovation to work in India. Obviously, all of us have heard about a lot of the fertilizer, maybe 40 to 50% of the fertilizer actually not being taken up by plants and goes with rivers and oceans, and it creates its own challenges. So that is less a criticism of Borlaug, but more of like how it was used and implemented in terms of, trying to get the results that you wanted. There have been other sort of writers who've talked about, and I think we talked about this package approach, right? Like there's seed, there is fertilizer, and there's water, and if all of them are together, then those things can apply to a wide variety of situations. What has been called as wide adaptation. And other people like Marcy Baranski, she has written a lot about it, where she felt that the wide adaptation only benefited rich farmers. What we need now is more localized seed and genetics, which hopefully can use less fertilizer and less water, which is a challenge for a lot of farmers, especially if you're towards the lower end of the economic spectrum.
Yeah, and along similar lines, and this is an interesting conversation just about ag innovation in general, is like, to what extent and to what duration does a farmer benefit from ag innovation? So, ultimately, is this just going to create a commodity market where the real beneficiaries are the intermediaries like a Cargill, ADM, not to pick on those two companies, but companies that buy the grain and trade the grain all over the world, as opposed to the farmers growing it? And I think that's a bit of a separate conversation from this, because a lot of times what we're talking about here is having enough food versus not having enough food, but certainly a criticism of basically just creating a more industrialized food system in general and the impact that has on farmers in these areas. So I think it's again, a point worth mentioning, but I certainly think that these two ideas will continue to find ways to overlap. And I know, regenerative agriculture, or the conversation around soil health, I think is an effort to that end, to not only consider what's possible in terms of genetics and fertilizer and water, but what's possible in terms of biology and ecology as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we not going to talk a lot about the other scientists on this podcast episode, but to a lot of those folks, the best agriculture takes care of soil first, right? And which is no different than the current discussions around regen ag. So, first time when I read the book, I felt I was a complete Borlaugian, but the second time I've read, like, maybe I'm somewhere in between. I see benefits on both sides in terms of, what is being talked about. And in fact, the funny incident I read here is that in 1943, White actually tried to convince Walt Disney to make a movie about soil. There are movies about soil right now. Walt Disney did not make that movie, but as early as 1943, especially after the Dust Bowl, people were really worried about soil health. And that is something that is not to be, ignored. That is very important.
Yeah, and I mean, even to this day, as I think about themes that interest me about the future of agriculture, genetics is one that definitely comes to mind. Soil is definitely one that comes to mind. And economics is certainly one that comes to mind. When I think about in those three areas, the advancements and the discoveries, the breakthroughs that we've had since Borlaug's work in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it gets me excited about both sides, both the wizard and the prophet side of what an understanding in those three areas can do for the future of agriculture. And, right now we're in this period of time where it feels like, at least in North America, our problems might have swung more in the direction of oversupply and overabundance. And I don't know, it's been a little hard for me to reconcile, like, okay, well, where does the story of Norman Borlaug fit into a narrative that is no longer about, growing enough food to feed everybody, but more about, like, how do we make sure that we have a food system that benefits everyone involved, producers and consumers? And I don't know, that's probably a whole nother episode in and of itself, but it's certainly something to think about.
Yeah, and I think as we read through the book, there are a lot of concerns about a growing population. Will be able to feed the world or not? And Norman Borlaug, through the work he did and the Green Revolution, they answered that question, emphatically that yes, we can. And now we have concerns around sort of dropping fertility rate. Maybe the population growth is going to slow down, maybe even go down. And you're absolutely right. Like, is producing enough calories, is that the main problem that we face now versus something else? And maybe that's a topic, as you said, for a future episode. But it is interesting how within last 7-10 years, the conversation has changed quite a bit in terms of what is most important when it comes to food and agriculture. I mean, I remember, and we've joked about this, that we want to feed a 10 billion population was a standard line in most startup pitches. Now, when people see that, they almost send it to the no pile when they see that line in a startup pitch. So it's interesting how things can change And they're very much context and situation dependent when it comes to a lot of the innovations.
Yeah, and the population outpacing our resources was the one thing that Borlaug and Vogt agreed upon. So it's kind of interesting. It's like the one premise that they were on the same page and then diverged from there. And so if you question that underlying assumption, it's really interesting. So then there needs to be a wizard, a prophet, and I don't know, an economist. I'm not sure somebody else to figure out this third dimension. But anyway, we've sort of touched on this along the way. But what are some kind of takeaways for ag innovators that listen to the show? You read this 400 and whatever it is, 50 plus page book. What would you say are kind of some takeaways for you and that you'd want to share with other aspiring ag innovators who listen to the show?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is that, a lot of the things that happened in Norman Borlaug's life, he didn't plan them. The tractor showing up, like he didn't plan for that, right? A lot of other things, I think he got a baseball sort of scholarship. So he was into sports and he used as a way to get to college, right? So I think the main thing is like, not everything can be planned, or most things cannot be planned out in your life. But at the same time, if you're working towards doing the right work and accumulating the skill set that are ready, when an opportunity comes along, I think you can take advantage of that. Right? I think Norman Borlaug's life is a ringing endorsement of that fact that you cannot plan everything in your life and your career, but you have to be ready when those opportunities come along.
Yes, I will say that what you just said, yes, and you got to be willing to be gritty when it's looking like it's not meant to be, because the opportunist in me is like, yeah, I just need to wait for the right opportunity. That's the only reason nothing's got done, because I haven't waited for the opportunity. But you have to be able to not only recognize that opportunity, but see it through the haze of a lot of crap, like Norman Borlaug did. I love this excerpt from the book. It says, many years later, after he won the Nobel Prize, Norman Borlaug would look back on his first days in Mexico with incredulity. He was supposed to breed disease-resistant wheat in Mexico's Central Highlands. Only after he arrived in September 1944 did he grasp how unsuited he was for the task. He had never published an article in a peer-reviewed professional journal. He had never worked with wheat, or for that matter, bred any plants of any sort. In recent years, he had not even been doing botanical research. Since winning his PhD, he had been spending his time testing chemicals and materials for industry. He had never been outside the United States and couldn't speak Spanish. So it doesn't sound like the perfect fit for someone to go on and start the Green Revolution in central Mexico. But I think that's a point, right? He saw the opportunity. He was willing to roll up his sleeves and do whatever it takes. He fought through some incredible adversity, and it's, I don't know, it's a pretty inspiring story. And it makes me hope that I have anywhere near that level of resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something else, that we discussed earlier before starting this was, as you said, right, these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not just one person doing it. It's always a team. You also need a lot of mentors and partners to help you with that process, because you cannot do it on your own. These problems are difficult, very challenging, as we have discussed so far. You don't say, I want a mentor, or this is what I'm looking for. He had the mental understanding that, I need help, and these are people I should go talk to and learn from them and teach people along the way, right? So there's so many different stories in the book. Maybe, Tim, if you want to touch on a few folks in there who really had a big influence on his life.
Yeah, I think we should mention, first of all, his research was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And there was one guy in particular who was leading this effort on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation named Warren Weaver, who was a mathematician who was just absolutely convinced that the problem of hunger could be solved through science and technology, and an advocate, obviously, for the work Borlaug was doing, even when it wasn't going well. And so, I mean, if that didn't exist, it would be hard to picture this story playing out. Same thing, the mentor that Borlaug had when he was a grad student, Elvin Charles Stackman, very, very inspirational, and also the guy who recruited him to go down to Mexico and work on this project. And then who we've talked about a lot, MS Swaminathan in India, who we need to do a separate episode on, because just very intrigued by him and the work he's doing. So yeah, it's never just a solo person that's just out there on their own figuring it out. It always is a result of collaboration, of partnerships, of mentorship, and of groups coming together and working together So anyway, just another example of that. And for those of you listening, if you haven't read the book yet, The Wizard and the Prophet, you have probably gathered that we're not even barely scratching the surface of everything that's in this book. It's so detailed, so well researched, and very, very easy to read, very enjoyable to read if you're interested at all in ag innovation. We'll probably do a separate episode on William Vogt, I imagine, if you all would like to hear that. If you would, send us some feedback so that we know that. But even after that, we'll still just be scratching the surface. So I highly recommend you go pick up the book, The Wizard and the Prophet. It's very well worth a read. I can't believe in all these episodes about ag innovation I've done, this is the first one dedicated to Norman Borlaug. But again, this is just meant to serve as an introduction to him. We're still scratching the surface. We haven't even talked about his accolades. You know, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, went on to win basically every related award and recognition you could possibly think of, and just a remarkable individual. I don't know how you'd calculate this, but it's widely said that he's accredited with saving about 1 billion lives from starvation because of the work he did. 1 billion lives. I mean, it's just incredible. I'll just leave you here with one more excerpt from the book. Charles C. Mann says, Borlaug remained little known even after he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, but he and the Green Revolution had become exemplary to a certain sort of scientist, journalist, and environmentalist. The Borlaug package has become an emblem of the view that the road through humankind's environmental difficulties lies through the groves of scientifically guided productivity. Ours is the first civilization based on science and technology, Borlaug said in 1968. In order to assure continued progress, Borlaug goes on to say, we scientists must recognize and meet the changing needs and demands of our fellow men. The future of the world depends on science, he said, and on politicians guided by scientists. Thank you so much, Rishi, for doing this, for rereading the book with me, The Wizard and the Prophet. And thank you to Charles C. Mann for writing a book like this. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I don't take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.